The Gormenghast Trilogy by Mervyn Peake. Book 1. Titus Groan. Sepulchrave. Every morning of the year, between the hours of 9 and 10, he may be found seated in the stone hall. It is there, at the long table, that he takes his breakfast. The table is raised upon a dais, and from where he sits he can gaze down the length of the grey refectory. On either side, and running the entire length, great pillars prop the painted ceiling where cherubs pursue each other across a waste of flaking sky. There must be about 1,000 of them all told, interweaving among the clouds, their fat limbs forever on the move and yet never moving, for they are imperfectly articulated. The colours, once garish, have faded and peeled away, and the ceiling is now a very subtle shade of grey and lichen green, old rose and silver. Lord Sepulchrave may have noticed the cherubs long ago. Probably when a child he had attempted more than once to count them, as his father had done, and as young Titus in his turn will try to do. But however that may be, Lord Groan has not cast up his eyes to the old welkin for many years. Nor did he ever stare about him now. How could he love this place? He was a part of it. He could not imagine a world outside it, and the idea of loving Gormenghast would have shocked him. To have asked him of his feelings for his hereditary home would be like asking a man what his feelings were towards his own hand or his own throat. But his lordship remembered the cherubs in the ceiling. His great-grandfather had painted them with the help of an enthusiastic servant who had fallen 70 feet from the scaffolding and had been killed instantly. But it seemed that Lord Sepulchrave found his only interest in these days among the volumes in his library, and in a knob of jade on his silver rod which he would scrutinize for hours on end. Arriving, as was his consistent habit, at exactly 9 o'clock every morning, he would enter the long hall and move with a most melancholy air between rows of long tables, where servants of every grade would be awaiting him, standing at their places, their heads bowed. Mounting the dais, he would move around to the far side of the table where hung a heavy brass bell. He would strike it. The servants, sitting down at once, would begin their meal of bread, rice, wine, and cake. Lord Groan's menu was otherwise. As he sat this morning in his high-backed chair, he saw before him, through a haze of melancholia that filmed his brain and sickened his heart, robbing it of power and his limbs of health, he saw before him a snow-white tablecloth. It was set for 2. The silver shone, and the napkins were folded into the shapes of peacocks and were perched decoratively on the 2 plates. There was a delicious scent of bread, sweet and wholesome. There were eggs painted in gay colours, toast piled up pagoda-wise, tier upon tier, and each as frail as a dead leaf, and fish with their tails in their mouths lay coiled in sea-blue saucers. There was coffee in an urn shaped like a lion, the spout protruding from that animal's silver jaws. There were all varieties of coloured fruits that looked strangely tropical in that dark hall. There were honeys and jams, jellies, nuts and spices, and the ancestral breakfast plate was spread out to the great advantage amid the golden cutlery of the Groans. In the centre of the table was a small tin bowl of dandelions and nettles. Lord Sepulchrave sat silently. He did not seem to notice the delicacies spread before him, nor when for a moment or two at a time his head was raised did he appear to see the long cold dining hall, nor the servants at their tables. To his right, at the adjacent corner of the board, was arranged the cutlery and earthenware crockery that implied the imminent arrival of his lordship's breakfast companion. Lord Groan, his eyes upon the jade knob of the rod which he was twisting slowly upon its ferrule, again rang the brass bell, and the door opened in the wall behind him. Sourdust entered, with great books under his arm. He was arrayed in crimson sacking. His beard was knotted, and the hairs that composed it were black and white. His face was very lined, as though it had been made of brown paper that had been crunched by some savage hand before being hastily smoothed out and spread over the tissues. His eyes were deep-set and almost lost in the shadows cast by his fine brow, which, for all its wrinkles, retained a sweeping breadth of bone. The old man seated himself at the end of the table and stacked the 4 volumes beside a porcelain decanter, and raising his sunken eyes to Lord Groan, murmured these words in a weak and shaking voice, and yet with a certain dignity, as though it were not simply a case of having to get through the ritual, but that it was now, as always, well worth getting through.
I, Sourdust, Lord of the Library, personal adviser to your lordship, nonagenarian and student of the Groan law, proffer to your lordship the salutations of a dark morning, robed as I am in rags, student as I am in the tomes, and nonagenarian as I happen to be in the matter of years.
This was delivered in one breath, and then he coughed unpleasantly several times, his hand at his chest. Lord Groan propped his chin on the knuckles of his hand that were cupping the jade knob. His face was very long and was olive-coloured. The eyes were large, and of an eloquence withdrawn. His nostrils were mobile and sensitive, his mouth a narrow line. On his head was the iron crown of the Groans that fastens with a strap under the chin. It had 4 prongs that were shaped like arrowheads. Between these barbs small chains hung in loops. The prerogative of precedence on his side, he was wrapped in his dark grey dressing-gown. He did not seem to have heard Sourdust's salutations, but focusing his eyes for the first time upon the table, he broke a corner off a piece of toast and placed it mechanically in his mouth. This he muzzled in his cheek for the major part of the meal. Sourdust had helped himself to one of them, a slice of watermelon and a fire-green egg, but all else lost its freshness or its heat upon the ritualistic table. Below, in the long basement of the hall, the clattering of the knives had ceased. The rice wine had been passed up and down the table, and the jugs were empty. They were waiting for the sign to go about their duties. Sourdust, having wiped his old mouth with a napkin, turned his eyes to his lordship, who was now leaning back in the chair and sipping at a glass of black tea, his eyes unfocused, as usual. The librarian was watching the left eyebrow of his lordship. It was 21 minutes to 10 by the clock at the far end of the hall. Lord Groan appeared to be looking through this clock. 3/4 of a minute went by. It was 10 seconds, 5 seconds, 3 seconds, 1 second, to 20 to 10. It was 20 minutes to 10. Lord Groan's left eyebrow rose up his forehead mechanically and stayed suspended beneath 3 wrinkles. Then it slowly lowered itself at the movement. Sourdust arose and stamped upon the ground with an old thin leg. The crimson sacking about his body shook as he did so, and his beard of black and white knots swung madly to and fro. The tables were at once emptied, and within half a minute the last of the retainers had vanished from the hall, and the servants' door at the far end had been closed and bolted. Sourdust reseated himself, panting a little and coughing in an ugly way. Then he leaned across the table and scratched the white cloth in front of Lord Groan with a fork. His lordship turned his black and liquid eyes towards the old librarian and adviser. "Well," he said, in a far-away voice, "what is it, Sourdust?"
"It is the 9th day of the 9th month," said Sourdust.
"Ah," said his lordship. There was a period of silence, Sourdust making use of the interim by re-knotting several tassels of his beard. "The 9th," repeated his lordship.
"The 9th,"
muttered Sourdust. "A heavy day," mused his lordship. "Very heavy." Sourdust, bending his deep-set eyes upon his master, echoed him.
"A heavy day, the 9th. Always a heavy day."
A great tear rolled down Sourdust's cheek, threading its way over the crumpled surface. The eyes were too deeply set in their sockets of shadow to be seen. By not so much as the faintest sign or movement had Sourdust suggested that he was in a state of emotional stress. Nor was he ever, save that at moments of reflection upon matters connected to the traditions of the castle, it so happened that great tears emerged from the shadows beneath his brow. He fingered the great tomes beside his plate. His lordship, as though making the resolve after long deliberation, leaned forward, placed his rod on the table, and adjusted his iron crown. Then, supporting his long olive chin with his hands, he turned his head to the old man. "Proceed," he whispered. Sourdust gathered the sacking about himself in a quick, shaky way, and getting to his feet, moved around to the back of his own chair, which he pushed a few inches closer to the table, and squeezing between the table and the chair, he reseated himself carefully, and was apparently more comfortable than before. Then, with great deliberation, bending his corrugated brow upon each in turn, he pushed the varied assortments of dishes, cruets, glasses, cutlery, and by now tepid delicacies away from before him, clearing a semicircle of white cloth. Only then did he remove the 3 tomes from beside his elbow. He opened them